Hello and welcome. My name is Melissa Galasso, and I'm very excited to be with you here today to talk about a brand new ASU that has come out of the FASB. Now, this is a very interesting ASU. It has to do with a new type of financing that is getting more attention, but that some people may not be familiar with. I know when they first started doing research on it, I actually hadn't heard of it before, so I had to do a little bit more understanding. But ASU 2022-04, which is related to disclosures of supplier finance program obligations, was trying to provide more feedback for users. And so these are very interesting because it really encourages collaboration between buyers and sellers. And so banks sort of facilitate this type of finance program, and users wanted to know a little bit more about, are you using this? What is the impact? And so in this scenario, an entity would order from a supplier, right? And the supplier would fulfill the order and invoice the buyer, right? Sounds like a normal situation. However, the buyer then approves the invoice for payment and confirms to the financial institution that as part of this payment is correct. As part of this, the supplier then sells at a predetermined discount. So this is where the financial institution makes their money to the financial institution, that ability. Then the supplier receives the funds right away. So they basically get the money up front, and the discount is already incorporated into that. And then the buyer pays the financial institution. So while the financial institution is going to give the money right away at a discount, it ultimately will be the receiver of the funds. And so the buyer will pay the financial institutions at the maturity of the invoice. So this is a little bit different than what we normally think of as factoring, right? Factoring is when we sell the invoice to get the cost right away. So sometimes this is actually referred to as reverse factoring. And so kind of an interesting process as we go through here. And why would a supplier want to do this? Well, lower trade receivables, especially in a tight economy, that always can help. Increase in cash position, if that's something that's important to them. And then faster access to cash at really good rates. The discount is not very significant, and so it helps them with their cash flow, gives them that faster access to cash, and that gives them obviously a quicker cash conversion cycle, so when they need that cash, they can do so. So this is a new type of program that is out there. You can actually Google it, and you'll find a lot of companies who actually offer this. And so as a result, the FASB decided to take a look at these because, one, there's no explicit disclosure requirements in GAAP regarding these types of programs, and buyer party may present obligations covered by these programs in the same balance sheet line items as like an accounts payable, or potentially in another line item, depending on the facts and circumstances. And so it wasn't necessarily clear to the to users where exactly these are going to be, because again, they have made this purchase. They're going to pay for it, but again, they're going to pay the supplier as part of this. And so there's no explicit guidance in here. So in September 2022, FASB took on this new project here and issued ASU 2022-04, Supplier Finance Programs, Disclosure of Supplier Finance Program Obligations, to address some of the concerns of users. So what is the definition here? So when we look at this, very often you need to have this definition. So the supplier finance allows a buyer to offer its supplier the option, right, to for access to payment in advance of an invoice due date, which is paid by a third-party finance provider or intermediary on the basis of invoices that the buyer has confirmed as valid. So again, the supplier signs up for it from the buyer, right? And so the buyer is really the one who's initiating this, as opposed to a typical accounts receivable that you could factor. This program is offered by the buyer with this intermediary. So these are called a bunch of different things. Sometimes they're referred to as reverse factoring or payables finance, or even structured payable arrangements. And so all of those really are referring to the supplier program. And so we enter into this program with a finance provider or intermediary to establish the program, right? So the first thing the buyer has to do is reach out to this institution and set up the program. Then again, they continue to purchase their goods and services from the supplier and they say, hey, I'm going to pay you at, this date. And then the finance provider or the intermediary of that invoice supplier invoices that it has, a valid invoice. Now, once they have a valid invoice, the supplier can request that early payment from the supplier only for those invoices, again, that have been confirmed. So we want to make sure we're only paying for what we actually owe. So as you can probably imagine, the presentation of this, no gap. Recognition measurement, no gap, but we're not changing that. What we're changing here are going to be our disclosures. And so there are annual disclosures as well as interim disclosures. And so in each annual period, the buyer needs to disclose the key terms, right? What's the description of the payment terms? What's the timing? What's the basis for the termination? Are there any assets pledged as security or other forms of guarantee provided by for committed payment to the finance provider or intermediary? And then for the obligations that the buyer has confirmed as valid to the finance provider, again, they can then pay these even though the buyer hasn't made a payment, right? Supplier's already been paid, but the buyer can still have this as an accounts payable because they haven't paid the third party. And so as a result, the amount outstanding that remains unpaid from the buyer as of the end of the period, which is basically the confirmed amount that they have agreed to pay, and a description of where those obligations are presented. Because again, some people are leaving them in AP because they owe that payment. They're just not going to pay the supplier. They're instead going to pay the intermediary. And so some people leave it there. Some people move it out of AP. And so we just want to know where we're just putting these on the balance sheet. And then a roll forward of those obligations during the period, right? So what amounts were confirmed, what were subsequently paid. And so this roll forward is obviously going to be a little bit more complicated. So when we look at the transition for it, you're going to notice that there's some specialty guidance on the transition here. But the goal was really to provide additional disclosures about the program so that users better understand, right, the effect of the program, how it impacts working capital, liquidity, and cash flow. But it doesn't change recognition, measurement, or financial statement presentation, right? So whatever you're doing is not being changed by this. This is strictly a disclosure only impact, but it is important for the users to understand where it is being presented so they can incorporate that as part of their process. Now, if you perform interim disclosures, these are predominantly entities that are publicly traded or who choose to do interim financial statements. In each interim reporting period, you're going to disclose the amount of obligations outstanding that the buyer has confirmed as valid to the finance provider or intermediary as of the end of the interim period. So you don't do the full roll forward, but in your interim, you are going to be required to have those disclosures for the amount outstanding. All right, so when is this going to be effective? So obviously we are going to do this for years beginning after December 15, 2022. Came out pretty late in the year, so we wouldn't want to do it right now for our 2022 year end. So we're going to do it for our 2023 year ends and beyond. However, it does include interim periods within. So for that interim reporting, they're not pushing it back. So starting with Q1 of 2023, we'd have to do that for those interim. However, as you can see here, they did give an exception, as I mentioned earlier, for the roll forward, because the roll forward is going to require a little bit more effort to be able to do. So that will be effective for fiscal years beginning after December 15, 23, allowing you to come up with the methodology for tracking that as part of it. Now, it is early adoptable. So if you feel very strongly that these disclosures would help your user or your user really wants them, you obviously can. And then obviously during the year of adoption, the information on key terms and the balance sheet presentation, et cetera, which are annual, would be obviously disclosed as part of those interim periods to make sure that people are understanding it. And then these are retrospective. So that's what makes the roll forward a little bit harder, is that we do have to do a retrospective application. So if you have comparative years, you're going to basically get an extra year. So you can do it in the current year, and then you can do it in the following year to get that comparative year without having to try to redo the prior year. And so the amendments would be applied retrospectively to each period in which the balance sheet is presented, obviously, except for the information on the roll forward, which will be done prospectively. So we're trying to make this a little bit easier in terms of the adoption, because we know this is not an easy process to necessarily, if you haven't been properly tracking it, to be able to provide that. So this is really just giving us that extra ability. All right, so that is a wrap on our newest ASU. Hopefully you got a little bit of information about this. If you're not familiar with these and are interested in learning more, you can definitely Google it. There are a lot of different ones out there. I know I did when I was trying to figure out exactly what these were and to look for examples of them. So this is your opportunity. So I want to thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope to see you on a future Nano Learning. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.